Great. Good morning, Roshni. Thank you so much for joining this. I'm really excited to have you. Was so excited to see your success at Wharton and some of the great awards that you were given by the other students in your class. So I always knew you were going to be fantastic, and so far you've proven me right. So it's really great to reconnect with you a couple years after we worked together. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. I'm excited. I try to help out as many people as I can on their B school application process. Because I know it's stressful, and if you don't go through it once, you're just kind of like confused as to what to do.
Yeah. So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit more about you and your background, and what now that you just graduated from Wharton.
Yeah. So I'm Roshni, and before going to Wharton, I worked at Amazon as a financial analyst and then a data scientist. And then I was a PM for a little bit before I decided that, you know what, I wanted to leave and I wanted to get some life perspective. And that's a very vague term, but really the thing that keeps me up at night all the time, and this is going to sound weird, is that I very much want to do something about all the poor people in the world, all the problems that they're facing. Like I spend my free time right now volunteering at prisons. And so I went to Wharton. I didn't write this in my essay, but I went to Wharton to really figure out how people can be influenced to think beyond themselves. And I spent a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to figure out what are the different types of influences. How do you get people to think about more than just their needs and think about the overarching world's needs, right? Because not everyone is incentivized by that. And my first year, I kind of just was confused all the time because it's a very introspective process, right? To figure out how to influence others, because you first have to figure out how are you influenced and what are you incentivized by.
Very true.
Right, and that's always a very difficult journey. But then I'm not going to say like I'm an expert on this now, but I got farther ahead in this topic, and then I spent my second year trying to see how I can get people to think big. And so I did that by doing stand-up comedy. Like I do stand-up comedy for fun. I also joined the boxing club, and I became one of the fight night champions for Wharton.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Because women who look like me usually are not boxers, right?
Well, we're definitely going to have to do a second video because I want to hear the stand-up routine for sure.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And in my stand-up routine, I would talk a lot about how people, like in a funny way, how people are influenced by what another person looks like or how they talk. Or it's not the content that matters so much. It's how you polish it out. And how you represent it. And it's funny, that's exactly what the B school application process is about. And so I learned a lot about that, and then I won that award. And then I decided to join Amazon again because I wanted to see how much of what I have learned in business school I can actually apply. And I figured the best way to do that would be to go back to my old employer. And I had a lot of other offers. I was blessed to get that, but I decided to go back to Amazon to actually figure that out. And it's amazing. I've actually learned so much. Like I've learned how to work with people who have different incentives, how to get them to think beyond just their promotion, to think for the bigger product. And right now I am the privacy lead for Kindle content, which means that I am in charge of figuring out what privacy looks like for Kindle and how to not scare off customers from the large amount of data that we collect, and how to make it more CX friendly, how to make the whole UX look like a customer knows exactly what their data is being used for and what it'll ultimately do in the back end. So that's all the things that I work on, and something that Kindle has never thought about. And so it's like a very different thing. And so I'm very excited about it.
Very cool. So one thing you said that I think was really interesting is about getting clear on your own vision and where you want to go. And
Yeah.
I know a lot of candidates go into the MBA process thinking, I'm not really sure who I want to be or what my mission is. So how clear were you on that applying into business school, and what type of work or reflection did you have to get clear on that before or while you were applying to business school?
So I think I'll take this question in two different stages,
Okay.
before business school and then during business school. So before business school, I was always passionate about social causes and doing things to help the world. But that's very generic, and I think a lot of people care about that.
Right.
But I didn't know how to put my feelings into action. I mean, I was on a few nonprofit boards and all of that, but what I found consistently was that I was never satisfied with being on a board, because it was just a lot of theory and not so much action.
Yeah.
And so I went, and so my essay itself was around starting a charity around people who have mental illnesses and giving them on-the-job training, and then letting them, go out, giving them the training needed to go out into the real world and get the job. And this was motivated by my mom's own struggle with mental illnesses and how she was never able to hold a job because of it.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right. And a lot of people end up on the street just because they're mentally ill. Right. And that's not fair. Right.
Yeah.
And I just, so my essay was around that. But when I entered business school, I had no idea, absolutely no idea how I would make any of this happen, whether this charity was actually viable. I mean, there's a lot of other charities that do this. And I also cared about so many different things as well, not just this. And the first thing that I did was, when I got to Wharton, I tried to get a more clear vision around it. And amazingly, I didn't, because it's like drinking from a fire hose, right? There's so many different things that happen in business school, and keeping track of everything is overwhelming.
I bet.
Right? And it's so easy to get lost during that process.
Yeah.
And so what I started doing was, I would first, my first foray into it was in my first semester. That was when the Syria bombings were happening. And I saw this Facebook video about this little boy, I think a toddler, who was not able to cry anymore because, sorry if I'm going into too much detail, but he wasn't able to cry anymore because he was so traumatized by the bombings. And that really struck a nerve with me. I just started crying watching that video, and I was like, oh my God, we have to do something about it, because I'm like a very reactionary person, right? And, I put together this fund at Wharton to make it so that every $3 that are donated by a Wharton person, $1 will be donated by the administration.
Wow.
Yeah. And this actually has a very bad ending to it, in that it got downvoted. My idea itself, they said that they can't have Wharton backing something so publicly, because then it takes the attention away from the actual crisis, which I didn't understand. But now looking back on it, I think the problem was that I didn't think through what the actual process is of convincing people. I was just like, you know what, this is a great idea. People will like it no matter what. Like, it's selfless, all of that. And I never thought through the incentives that other people are incentivized by. And that was my problem. And it took me another 6 months to think through that failure. I mean, what did happen was, they were surprised that I cared so much about it, despite not being Middle Eastern, and not having any personal connection to it. So what they instead did was publicize it, that I had all these 3 charities that I would like to donate to. And so if you want to donate to it, then you should go ahead and do that. It wasn't officially sanctioned by Wharton, but I had many people reach out to me saying, okay, which one do you think I should donate to? What does this charity do versus this one? Like, all of that. So that was great. So they helped me out in that aspect, but it wasn't like an official thing. but I still kind of, saw it as a failure because I had something else in mind versus what ended up happening. And that is where I started learning about social influence, credibility, everything that you kind of learn in negotiations. I
Yeah.
really internalized it. And so by the end of my journey at business school, what I decided was, and this is something else because I looked into a lot of charities, which charity I'd want to work for, all of that. And what I learned was there's a lot of charities in the world. What they need is money, and what they need is influential people caring about it. And so now my goal is, of course, I spend my free time volunteering, but my goal is to become someone really influential one day so that I could be like, okay, I'm going back to The Rock, but because I really love The Rock. But I could be like The Rock and be like, I'm donating to this charity. You should too. And like a whole bunch of people will donate to it, right?
Yeah.
Which is worth a lot more to a charity than just like me wanting to start my own. And then, the efficacy of charities is also like, up in the air. So what I hope to do is one day get enough money to just like donate sums of money.
That's interesting. So it sounds like before business school, you were more focused on finding an individual cause to kind of marry your brand to, whereas now you've learned a lot more about kind of social giving and humanitarian efforts in general, and you want to kind of create yourself into charities kind of wherever you touch them.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think what Bill Gates is doing is great, and now he's convincing other people to do the same. So that is really, really great. But I want to take it a step further and start doing it before I become, if I ever become like Bill Gates. Like I do it
when
now.
you become like Bill Gates.
That's true. When. And so I've started doing it now already, and I get to, get people to think about issues that they normally don't think about because that's not something that they come across in their everyday life. And now what I'm doing right now is I'm volunteering at prisons, and it turns out that, and I'm doing it because I have a personal aspect to it, where my mom actually experienced with this, and so I volunteer at prisons, and what I find is that a lot of them don't have physician access, and a lot of them are in jail for nonviolent crimes, and they're in there for a long time, and so anyway, that's all the things that I'm motivated by and that I'm trying to go
towards. No, that's super interesting, and you're so inspiring. I loved working with you back in the day, and you haven't changed a bit in terms of your likability. So it's really
Thank you.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about the admissions process for you. And when people hear Wharton, they feel like success is almost impossible, especially if I have any kind of weakness or blip on my application. And I remember that you had a GMAT score that was slightly below average for Wharton, like a great GMAT score. I think you had like a 710. Did you have any concerns about your capability of getting into Wharton, and how did you address any perceived weaknesses to better your chances?
Yeah. So I think my biggest weakness was my GMAT score in my application, because I think Wharton's average is now like 740, and I had a 710.
Mm-hmm.
I think my math score fell in like the 73rd percentile.
Okay.
And that was my third try on the GMAT, and I was not going to take the GMAT again.
You had enough fun at that point.
Exactly. Too much fun. I needed to scale it back. Right. And so I decided that I would find other ways to show in my application that I had analytical skill. It really helped at that point that I was a data scientist at Amazon, and that I'd done some really great work, landed in the top 1% of data scientists in my review, all of that. But I knew I would need to do more than that. And the way I got around it was by highlighting the more analytical parts of my resume. Yeah. And then and Wharton has this like supplemental, like every B school does, where it's like, if you have any more information, you should tell it now.
Yeah, right.
And my essay for that was around how I came up with a system that uses machine learning to to figure out what the value of a customer is. Because we were struggling to figure out the value of a new customer. But now what it would do is create a profile and then create a segment of the profiles. And then based off of the initial browsing history of the customer, it would tie it back to which of these profiles it was most likely to hit.
Got it.
Because the problem was that it's hard to know how much money to spend on a customer if you don't quite know which band they fall into.
Sure.
And how much they're about to spend with Amazon.
Right, makes sense.
And great. That was like, I think it was analytical enough to get me to the interview. And then during the interview, Wharton has a TBD process where it's a team-based discussion. Right. I know they've changed it a little bit, but it's still a team-based discussion.
That's right.
And during that interview process, it's just really important that you come across and that you are a genuinely nice person who cares about working in a team. And that you care about making sure everyone is comfortable enough to come up with ideas rather than dominating the conversation. And there were definitely people in my discussion who wanted to dominate the conversation, and they didn't get in.
Interesting.
They did not, and I think one of them had like a really high GMAT score. They didn't get in, and what they really cared about was how well you work together in a team.
Yeah.
I think it's a fantastic way to interview. The only downside, I think, is that if you're introverted, you don't know when to speak up, and it's not like naturally your forte. But Wharton, I know, has done some things to change that now so that it's more equal for extroverts and introverts, and that's not something that influences
Yeah, that's really interesting you talk about that, because I went through a similar exercise in interviewing for the Park Fellow Scholarship at Cornell, which I ultimately got. And I took the same approach where I wasn't trying to be the loudest person in the room. I was just trying to be supportive. And then when opportunities came for me to kind of showcase my skills, then I stepped up. But I wasn't trying to be kind of overbearing and really wanted to kind of support my teammates. And that's interesting that worked for you as well.
Yeah. And it's also, and I'm sure you'd agree, it's also not about the most talk time. It's about the quality of your ideas and how well you support someone else's idea.
For sure.
But I remember I was sitting there and this one other candidate came with a great idea, and I was like, never mind, scratch my idea. Your idea is way better for this reason. And I was being genuine about it. And I saw like the interviewer person who was observing us write down, like, scratch something in her notepad when I said that. So yeah.
I love that. So let me ask you this, and this is going to feel like a weird question, I think, but you make such a good impression, right? You're so bubbly. You're so easy to talk to. How did you get that way? Like, how do you present if I had to ask you, like, what are your best tips for making a good impression on a classmate? Is that something that just comes innately to you, or is that something that you have kind of built on over time? Like, what are your tips for effective communication? Because you're just such a good communicator.
How personal did I get?
as personal as you're comfortable.
Well, the thing is that if I get too personal, it's not like a widely relatable story.
Okay.
So, I mean, I guess okay. You know what? All right. Let me start.
Yeah, just answer intuitively, because I would love to, even for myself, I'd love to hear your response, because you're so dynamic and you build rapport with people so easily, which I'm sure helped you in the interview process, including in that group interview. So I think that's a really relevant question to ask you specifically.
Yeah. So I think you know a little bit about my background, where I had a very difficult childhood and upbringing. And it has led to, and I thought it was just me, but turns out my brother is that way too. So I think it was definitely our upbringing. It has led to both my younger brother and me having this sense of we should do more for the world than just care about ourselves. Yeah. And that is our ultimate goal. And so we try to develop skills that will take us towards that goal. It's a very generic goal, but we feel very strongly about it. And on top of that, what has really helped me is realizing that at the end of the day, no matter what happens, it's okay. Even if you fail, it's okay.
Well,
There are many, many opportunities in the world, and getting an MBA is not the end all be all of everything,
yeah,
right? Which I know during the process it feels like it,
sure.
but it's not. And
Yeah.
and the great thing about it is that if you don't have expectations on yourself, your natural genuinity comes out. And I'm just a very like laid back, like jokey person, and I became that way because I had to be, because I had such a stressful and traumatic childhood that if I wasn't that way, I probably would not be in this position right now.
Right.
But like for people who haven't had this sort of childhood, it actually really helps to not put expectations on yourself. And it helps much more. And when you don't have expectations on yourself, you're able to actually see the bigger picture. You're able to see the efficacy of someone else's idea. You're able to not get bogged down by all the weeds and think longer term.
I love that. So it's keeping things in perspective, recognizing that if one avenue doesn't work, there's other avenues available, and almost in a way just kind of keeping the pressure off yourself and recognizing, like you said, that everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And
I love that.
once you don't have the pressure, you realize there's so many different ways to get to whatever you need to. So like, for example, let's say you're in if you're a data scientist and you want to get into private equity. One way to do that is to go from data science to product management and then get really good at product management. And then eventually a VC or a PE firm will reach out to you as one of their hires, their industry hires, right? Like you don't have to go to business school. I mean, yes, it's much more difficult than nonlinear, I think.
Yeah, right.
I mean, the transition is even difficult in business school, but it is possible to do that. Like anything is possible. I think the only thing that's not possible is for me to suddenly be 6 feet tall. Which I hate. I'm like 5'2", and I hate that I'm
there
short.
are stilts you can buy.
Yes, exactly. You can get stilts.
Really high heels.
Yeah, exactly. But like most things professionally that people want to do is definitely possible. There's multiple different ways to get there. And so that removed a lot of the pressure. And so in the interview, I just came across as like this bubbly, like this zany person. And I feel like what my hope is that every person I meet, I make them laugh and that I lift up their mood.
I love it.
And that's what I did in my team. I was just like, wait, that's a much better idea. I was like, let's go with that idea. Like I was willing to call myself out. I was slightly self-deprecating, like all of that. Like, and it really helped because the interviewer during the 15-minute get to know you portion, one-on-one portion was like, okay, you know what? We really love your personality. Is there anything else that you want to let us know? If not, like I can connect you with some MBAs who are there right now. And so like she was already thinking of me as a student. And so that was.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about kind of being humble, because you need to be able to do that in business school too. Right. I remember in the classroom, like I'd be proven wrong all the time in case study discussions. And that was a great learning for me. So if I had just kind of stuck a stake in the ground and said, no, this is my opinion and I'm sticking to it regardless of what anybody says, like that's just me being stubborn. I'm not going to learn that way. Whereas being able to say like, hey, that's a really good point. I didn't even think of that. Like you win. And I think being able to display that self-awareness and that willingness and ability to learn from other people in the application process, however you can, is makes you a good fit for a program. So I think that's really insightful.
Right. Thanks. That's a much better way of saying what I said.
No, not at all. So what do you think was the biggest thing about you that differentiated you in the application process other than your wonderful personality?
It's hard to just have a personality show up in the essay, you know?
It's right. It is. Yeah. So what was your kind of strategy to make sure that you stood out from other applicants on the written page when you couldn't be in a room making people laugh yet in the interview?
Right. You know, I think the biggest lesson that I learned, that it's not what your story is, but it's more how you represent it. Because, I mean, I talked about my mom and her mental illnesses and how that's how that's pushed me to think beyond myself and like basically like a sort of a business plan for my charity. That was what my essay was about.
Right.
But I really struggled with writing it in a way that didn't seem businessy and seemed more personal.
Yeah.
And that was a huge struggle for me until I was talking to one of my friends, and she said, hey, like, it's not about what you're writing, it's how you're writing it. And she literally took like sentences from one portion of the essay and moved it up and moved it down. And she didn't write any new content. She just moved sentences around. Yeah. And it went from a terrible essay to a great essay. Right? And I remember talking to you about it. I was like, wait, that's all it took. And you're like, yeah, that's all it takes is like, you know,
right.
how you represent it. And so
that's right.
I think what really, like, I met people in business school had amazing backgrounds, but who were not at Wharton, and Wharton had been their top choice. And I read their essay, and it really was just how they framed it.
Yeah.
It wasn't that they didn't have anything special. Like, everyone has an amazing story to tell.
Right.
It's how you tell it that matters.
Yeah. So what's the most important part of telling an effective story? Like, if you had to say, like, you're has to do X, what would that be? Is it just staying informal, or is another element that you think is really important to building rapport?
I think it has to do with, it's the same as product management, right? Where whatever idea you come up with or a story about yourself, you have to see how it fits into the bigger picture of the school's mission and your own life story. And then you have to illustrate that life story in a way that's engaging and that is also fits the puzzle pieces together in the reader's mind very quickly. Because once, right? Because I think before the applicant, the person who reviews your applications, before they look at your essay, I think they look at your GMAT score, they look at everything. So they have a picture in mind. And
right.
what you have to do, and I got this tip from someone who ended up going to Harvard, was that you have to figure out how you want to represent yourself. And that essay has to just go for that representation very, very well, in a very clear, interesting, engaging way. And the representation I wanted to go for was, hey, this is the childhood I had. And because of this childhood, I really have a lot of empathy for people who don't have the opportunities that I do. And so what I want to do is make sure that people have these opportunities. And when I come to Wharton, these are the this is what I want to start. And this is the way Wharton will help me. And you write down all the different things. And then you also have something around how Wharton will be helped, because you also have to paint that picture. I think the part that a lot of people forget, they talk about how like the business school will help them, but they never talk about how they will help.
That's so true. And there's so many schools now that actually ask that question, how will you contribute to the campus? And so many clients that I work with have their first draft talking about all the benefits they're going to get from the school. And I was like, that is literally the opposite of what's being asked. Like, they really want to know your value add to other students to make their experience better. Yeah,
exactly. And I think someone in my school wrote an essay around how they're very good at strategic thinking because they're a chess master. And so, like, they put in some information about themselves that they weren't able to put in anywhere else. And then they also talked about how they would contribute. And they ended up being one of the students that actually they were very, very good. And they would teach their classmates how to think about situations and how to, like, think of it as like a chess move.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like a beautifully done essay, but it could have also gone really wrong if he hadn't represented it in the correct way.
That's interesting. I'm not going to call that candidate out, but I believe I worked with that person.
Oh, really? Okay.
I believe so. I don't have his permission to say that publicly, but I think I know exactly who you're talking about. So that's really interesting.
Okay.
But I think what you're essentially talking about is branding yourself and being true to who you are and being able to demonstrate your abilities are going to fit your target market, which in this case is the school, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely speaking my language. I say that. I mean, you say it very articulately. So I love that, the way you explained that there. That was perfect. So last question: any other advice that you would have for Wharton candidates specifically, just in terms of showing fit, demonstrating their interest in their school, things in your mind that kind of really differentiate it from other programs, or any other tips that you'd have for Wharton candidates?
Yeah. I think the best tip that I can give, that someone else gave me before I started at Wharton, and that I didn't follow for the first year, and then I remembered it, and I was like,
okay.
it is before you even start the application process, or let's say you've finished it and you are going to Wharton, it is really, really important that you figure out what you want to get out of it and all the different things that you're going to do to get out of it, and then actually make a list and write it down and then put it right in front of you. Because Wharton has a lot, I mean, it's one of the biggest business school class sizes. And so because of that, there are a lot of different resources, and that can also lead to a lot of distractions. And sometimes what happens is that students get so bogged down by the weeds and by all the resources that are there that they forget to think about themselves and what they came there for.
So they get distracted.
Yeah. Oh my God, there's so many different things that you can do. Every day there are so many things.
I'm sure.
And you also have to meet so many people, and that takes a lot of time. And so it's really important that you figure out why you're going there, what you want to get out of it, and how you're going to get there. So like for me, I knew I wanted to get really good at influencing people. And so even though that's a very, kind of a generic goal, what I did was I looked up all the resources that I would have, all the different like activities that I could do. And then I kept my mind open as to the different ways that I can learn to influence. And one of the things I did was I became the VP of marketing for India Club, because I wanted to make the events broader, like have more diversity and not have it just be Indians. And I figured this is a very good way to learn how to frame things in a way that different ethnicities would also now come to traditionally, Indian heavy events. And it was great. Like I actually, in my year, we had one of the most diverse events on campus, because I learned how to figure out what it is that people want from an event and how to tie it back to what we were doing and like how to market it that way. And it was great. And so it wasn't like on my radar when I got into business school, but because I had my mind open as to, hey, this is what I want to get good at, I was able to see opportunities in things that you traditionally wouldn't see opportunities in.
Got it. So what are the things that you think Wharton looks for specifically that maybe other schools don't? Like if you had to say like, these are like must demonstrate capabilities or characteristics for Wharton's culture, what would those things be in your mind?
So I think specifically Wharton looks for people who are very analytical. That's a given. That's known. But what they also look for are people with very interesting personalities. Like every person I met at Wharton was they had like these crazy ideas about things. And like it made class discussions so fun, because Wharton encourages disagreeing, and disagreeing politely, and then stating your opinion and making sure that you have a point as to why you're saying it. And so sometimes people would say things and I was like, what? That doesn't even make sense. But then they would back it up with their thinking, and it was phenomenal. And I've spoken to other students from other business schools, and what I find is that Wharton, I think, is the only one that encourages, at least from what I've seen, a lot of this like disagreeing and actively disagreeing and seeing different points and forcing yourself to not just agree because the whole room agrees with it.
I love that. That makes perfect sense. Roshni, this was great. Thank you so much. I think this is so insightful, so helpful. I'm inspired by you. I've been all, but even hearing you now, hearing your new ideas and seeing how they've evolved over the last couple of years is really awesome. So thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.